Hey everybody, welcome back to the Engineered Angler. Let's make a lure. This is a stick bait, and it's a lure that a lot of people have been requesting I make. You know, the kind that's being used for muskie, or even the kind the Aussies use, trolling and casting for those big, gnarly Pacific fish those guys catch. Now typically, I don't really like making giant lures because I really don't use them, but it occurred to me that I never really experimented on how big a lure a speckled trout or a redfish would actually hit out in the Gulf of Mexico. So I'm going to make this big enough so that it's going to be a challenge to actually catch a fish out there. But I want it to behave in a way that the fish out there will actually want to attack and not be afraid of. So that's going to be a little different from how these things are usually used. Most people will either troll these things behind the boat or give them a slow roll on the way back, maybe the occasional twitch, because they tend to want to swim back and forth, have that kind of a natural serpentine swimming action. And that would be good too. And I think the shape that I'm making here is going to be conducive to that kind of movement, but I'm not really focused on that. I'm really focused on a very hard twitch, kind of an erratic movement when you twitch it, and the ability for it to walk the dog as I'm bringing it back, if that's what I want to do. Also, I want to be able to pause it and have it sink really slowly in salt water. So those are all the things you have to think about as you're designing a lure, keeping all the details that we covered in part 1 and part 2 of weight and balance on designing lures. And if you haven't seen those, I'll go ahead and put a link up here. You should check them out, especially if you have any interest in designing your own lures. So since I want it to twitch and I want it to walk the dog, I know I want to have a lot of drag up front, very little drag out back, and most of my weight behind the center point, or as close to the center point as I can. I want the lure to drop more or less level, but tail down a little bit would be okay too. And that's going to depend on where we put the weight, and we'll determine that later on in the video. So let's go ahead and finish this design. To increase the drag up front, I'm going to go ahead and make an open mouth. And I'll have one deep carving for the gill. So the open mouth will give me a little extra drag up front, and this big change in shape here is going to give me an additional amount of turbulence. And that turbulent flow going down the flat sides is going to keep the body kind of loose and probably give us some big movement and maybe even that swimming action. Back here, we'll go ahead and truncate the tail a little bit for a nice blunt exit for the water. And that mouth will give me the opportunity to adjust for my tie-on point down just below the center line to adjust for that added area below the center line. Now, this is not only the center of the lure lengthwise, but it's also the widest point top to bottom. And it'll also be the thickest part of the lure too. So everything tapers down front to back, both top to bottom and the sides from that middle point. And I want to put my belly hook eye as close to the front as I dare without having it tangle in my leader. And I want to do that because that hook will add a lot of drag, and I want that drag as far forward as I can get it. So it'll probably go somewhere around here. And the tail hook eye will be angled down for a little more stability. Now, ideally, I wanted to use cherry to make this lure, but I don't have a piece big enough because I'm really going for about a 7-inch lure. And the only thing I have that's pretty dense is this nice piece of maple. And I want a dense wood because that'll limit the amount of weight I have to put in it without having to sort of distribute it across the body and ruin the action. And if you're new to the channel, my name's Franco. I'm a professional engineer, a lure designer, and lure maker, and an avid fisherman. And I make these videos to share some of the tricks and techniques that I've come up with and learned along the way, and to add a little bit of engineering and physics to the art of lure making. Now, the difference between cherry and maple in density is about 0.1 grams per cubic centimeter. So the cherry is about 17 or 18% denser than the maple. And it's also really a pleasure to work with. I wish I had a big enough piece. And it has a beautiful grain. I'll put a little alcohol on it and you guys can take a look. It really is a pretty wood. It holds really nice detail if you carve, and it smells great when you're sanding and cutting it. I'm going to go ahead and put my typical blue tape on my wood to transfer the drawing onto here. All right, let's get some dimensions. So it'll be 7 inches from nose to tail, which is somewhere around 178 millimeters. And it's going to be about 2 inches from top to bottom, which is about 51 millimeters. And I'm rounding a little bit. And if we do a cross section right here at the center, the lure is going to look something like this. It's going to be pretty wide at the very top. It'll taper down and have pretty flat sides. And those flat sides will wrap around towards the front and where the mouth is open. And the eyes should set on pretty flat spots. And the maximum width or thickness of the lure will be about 3/4 of an inch, which is about... Now I'm going to use screw-in eyes for these things. I'm not going to have a harness because this lure is so big, I really can get a really huge embedment length. And I know from my tests that a twisted, glued-in screw-in eye like this will not pull out. It's much more likely for a hook to straighten or my leader to break. So I'm pretty confident with this. So I like to start off with a center line and my limits of the length of the lure. I also mark where the center of the lure is going to be, since that's going to be my widest point. And I know there's going to be more material in the belly than there is on the back. I'm going to go ahead and shift this thickness down. The very edge of the wood will be the bottom of my lure. And then using these Draftsman curves, I'll draw in my curve. And to be sure it's symmetric, I'll just turn it over and draw it in the other direction. And I'll do a similar thing for the belly curve. Now I'm just going to draw in the open mouth and the gilt that we're going to carve. All right, and there it is. That's what we're going to cut out. All right, let's move on. So you'll have to excuse the air conditioning sound in the background, but right now what I've done is set these calipers to half the thickness of the wood, and I'm just going to scribe a center line in here. And you won't be able to see it on the camera, but I'll be able to follow it with a pencil, and I'll do that on the top and on the bottom. Then I'm going to mark how fat I want the front and the back. And the front is going to be about 3/8 of an inch, and I'm eyeballing it. And the back I'll have just a little smaller than that, about 1/4 of an inch. And all you really need is like something flexible enough to help you form the curve. And of course, the very center of it is the widest point. So make sure your mark is still there. And don't get too fussy with these lines. They're really just guidelines. If they look a little off, I usually just sketch them in a way that looks a little more symmetric. The idea is to get symmetry from one side to the other. So what I like to do with the belt sander is to work these lines, the front to back taper. And so I'll just roll this on the sandpaper until I've got that taper in the front and in the back. Now everything stays kind of flat in this plane, but that's okay. We do that next. After I got it nice and tapered, then I start tapering the bottom, taking a lot of material off to sort of get that wedge shape from top to bottom. Once I get that mostly taken care of, then I start rounding off the top and the bottom. All right, that's got us really close. Looks a little bit like that drawing of the cross section I did on the board. It's substantially narrower here than it is on top, and that's pretty much uniform all the way through. And now it's just a matter of rolling over the corners so the whole thing is nice and rounded top and bottom. Now a lot of guys like to do this by carving and then sanding by hand, and I think that's really good. This is really fast, and I've gotten pretty good with this machine. A lot of folks ask me, well, what about us guys who don't have power tools, don't have a place to keep them? And I mean, I haven't had power tools all my life either. So if you don't have power tools, you'll just have to replace them with patience and elbow grease and just enjoy the process. All right, so I've got it shaped and sanded, and I gotta say, it's looking really good as far as like how symmetric I got all the curves and the shape itself. The truth is that when you make big lures, it's just easier to shape them. Sure, there's more material, but it's just a lot easier to sight down the lines and to actually hold on to it while you're sanding. Little lures are hard to hold on to and just really tweaky to work. The only questionable thing I have right now is this little knot that I have right there where I'm doing my carving. But I think I'll be able to cover that up pretty good. So the next step I'm going to do is just go ahead and cut that gill plate to give it that contour, and then we'll give it a clear coat to seal it. All right, so I went ahead and just drilled the socket for the eye, filled in the divot with some resin, just so there wouldn't be a big air pocket underneath it. So now I want to draw in the gill. So what I did is take a little thin piece of plastic and I cut the contour that I wanted for the gill. And I'm going to use that as my template. And I put a little circle there to align with the eye and a little V to align with the mouth. And this way I can just align it and draw it in. And I can just use the other side and draw it in on the other side. I want to really remove a lot of material down here at the very bottom of the gill. And I'm sure everybody's going to agree that this is a real simple carving, so I'm not going to bore you with it. I'm just going to keep taking material off until I get a really nice notch in here. Alright, I'm pretty much happy with the finish now, at least of the carving anyway. I'm going to go ahead and drill some little holes so I can put some temporary eyes in this to be able to hold on to it and put just a preliminary clear coat on it, just to seal the wood. Alright, that'll do it, and I should be able to mount it on my telescoping lure holder. See if I can get a telescope. Might be stuck from all the glue. There you go. Stretch it out to give some tension to it. See what it looks like in the turner. I'm going to need to move this holding plate down the rod here, give it some space. We mount this right here, and it looks like it's going to turn without hitting anything, so I'm going to go ahead and put that clear coat on. So I'm going to wipe it down with a little bit of alcohol first. This will take the oil off and any little bit of dust that's left on it. And my intention really is to put just a sealing coat on there. It's not really meant to be much of a coat at all. I'm just going to smear it out. The wood will probably absorb quite a bit of it and get it so it doesn't absorb any water. It's just a matter of letting it set for, I don't know, I'm going to probably let it go for about an hour. And while we're waiting for that to set, let's go ahead and make our twist eyes. And I'm using .040 diameter stainless. This stuff is super strong and pretty easy to work. All right, just one more to go. All right, there we go. Then we got all three. All right, it's been long enough. And you can see it's got like a semi-shiny surface, but it's nice and sealed. I'm gonna go ahead and give this thing a really light sanding just to get all the little nubs off, and then we'll submerge it to find out how much weight we need to put in it. All right, I think it's ready to test. I'm gonna get my scale and my oversized container of water here, and I'll just turn the scale on with the water on it so it zeroes out. And I go over this technique in the masterclass on weight and balance, so if you're a little lost, check that video out. I'll go ahead and put a link in the description too. And we'll just submerge this nice and slowly, making sure we don't touch the bottom or the sides, and try not to get any bubbles trapped in it. So it looked like about 86.2. So the weight in water was 88.2 grams. And since water weighs 1 gram per cubic centimeter, that's also our volume. And this is the quickest way to find out what the target weight is for that lure to be perfectly suspending, which is 88.2 grams. And that weight would include all your hardware and the hooks and everything. But remember, we don't want a suspending lure. We want a lure that sinks slowly. And I know from experience that adding 5 to 15% as a correction factor to this actually gets me where I want to. Now, I'll need to add on the high side because we're also dealing with salt water. So my plan is to add 15% to this target weight, which gives us right at 101.4 grams. So that's going to be our target weight for the lure and all the hardware and all the weight we got to put inside it. So the weight of the lure and the hardware and the hooks, split rings, is 59.56. So we need to add weight to get to about 100. So I'm going to add a couple of these bullet weights and we get to 99.16, which is about 1.25 grams short. But I'm going to go ahead and go with these because I know I'm going to be adding a little more than 1 gram of weight in paint and eyeballs and the rest of the finish. All right, I've drilled the holes for the tie-on eyes, and I'm just going to place them in there just temporarily so that we can go do the next step. I'm also going to hang the hooks on this just temporarily so we can go ahead and hang it over here and find where the center of mass is. And that looks pretty close right there. So I'm going to go ahead and mark the body where this vertical line crosses it. And that should give me the spot where I can center my weights on. So now we just need to drill holes. All right, we've got these guys in there. Now we just need to fill these holes with something that will be easy to sand. And I'm just going to put some sawdust from having drilled this stuff, and I'll top it off with some UV resin. And then give it a shot with the UV light. And I'll just keep filling them up till I have a little bit of extra to sand back. And we should be at a nice sandable level there, maybe a little more. All right, well, I've got this nicely smoothed over, and I've also smoothed off the surface too. All right, it's time to glue in the hook eyes. And I'm going to use just some 5-minute epoxy. This is Gorilla Glue, but you can use just about any glue. Just feeling this lure, as big as it is, I'm just not used to making lures this big, and I don't have that sort of instinctual feel for weight and size and sort of the kind of stuff you sort of gain over years and years and hundreds of lures. And right now, I'm not feeling it. I'm not sure if this thing is going to act the way I want it to act or not. I don't know. It's really an experiment. I'm pretty sure about our flotation because that's just straight up physics. But then all the theory about drag and how this will react in the water, it really is a lot of theory. But I know it works pretty well with lures that are maybe half this size. We'll see what this thing does. I'm going to let that epoxy set for about 45 minutes, and then we'll go to the paint booth. Even my paint stand is at its limit holding this thing. It's a little heavy, it's a little big, but it'll work. What I want to go with is a mullet pattern because that's one of the most common bait fish out there that the fish are feeding on. So I'm going to go with kind of a black and gray sort of thing with a little bit of touch of gold here and there, and obviously some red in the gills. Let's get going. All right, we're going to start with a white base. pretty happy with that. Definitely is a little different to paint really big lures because you're painting in big swatches of color and it's easy to screw up. And it's also a little more difficult to handle. It fell off my holder and got a couple little blemishes on it, but I was able to cover them pretty well. But anyway, this is pretty good. It's got a little bit of a flash to it on the side, and I really like the way it looks straight on. Now it just needs to actually perform in the water. So I'm gonna go ahead and let this dry for a few hours, and then we'll put a clear coat on it, and then it's time to take it to the water. I almost forgot to put the polyacrylic mid coat on before I clear coat. Then I'll stick it in this little oven at about 100 degrees for about 40 minutes. Alright, it's the next day. I actually clear coated it this morning, and let's see what it looks like. Well, not as great as I thought it would come out. It's got a couple wobbles in it. It's not too bad though. Not sure what caused the sort of wobbly surface. It's not horrible, but it's not the kind of finish I'm used to getting. Alright, I've got the hooks on. Let's go ahead and put it on the scale and let's see how close we came to our target weight, which was, let's see, 101.4 grams. Let's see how close we are. 102.07. That's pretty doggone close. We're right at about a half a gram off. Alright, let's put it in the tank and see what it does. So I expect it to drop a little faster than it's going to in salt water, and maybe even a little more than we expect because we did go a little over on the weight. Let's see what it does. That's pretty slow. And it is dropping a little bit tail heavy, which is kind of what I was hoping for because I do want it to be tail heavy. And it is floating on that forward hook. I gotta tell you, that's as large a lure as I can fit in this little tank. Let's take this down to the lake and see what it does in the water. Alright, we're getting down here between thunderstorms. And don't forget, if you guys are enjoying this content, leave me a like for sure, and leave a comment and any suggestions you guys have for future projects. And don't forget to share. And if you haven't subscribed, come on, subscribe. It's free. All right, let's get on the boat. All right, looking pretty good. Let's see what it looks like in the water. I'm not sure it's obvious from the surface here, but when you let it drop, it just has this really cool wobble. And it does twitch really good. It turns almost all the way around. All right, that is pretty cool. It actually has a really nice drop through the water with a nice wobble. It actually twitches. When you hit it, it'll actually almost turn all the way around. It'll walk the dog, but you got to get just the right pace. It's just such a big lure. I'm gonna have to learn the pace of the lure. When you slow roll it back, it has that deep swimming action. The wake it leaves as it's swimming back. Look at that. It looks like a fish chasing a fish. Look at that. Look at that wake. Oh man, this is gonna be a lot of fun to fish with. Ho ho. Alright guys, thanks for watching. Next video is gonna be this in the Gulf of Mexico and probably a bunch of other lures that I made recently that I haven't used. So if you'd like to see one of my lures fished in salt water, let me know. Put it in the comments and I'll try to take it with me. I'll see you guys next Friday.